Well, I want to welcome everyone to the Provincial Health Leadership Program Keynote Address that's hosted by the George and Fahey Centre for Healthcare Innovation. I'm Dr. Peter Nickerson, Dean and Vice Provost of the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. And we're delighted to have Dr. Gillian Mandich join us this evening to share how we can effectively lead through change and uncertainty, manage remotely, boost happiness, and retain top talent amidst a world in constant change. I want to start by acknowledging the Centre for Healthcare Innovation and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the ancestral and current day lands and waters of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene Saline peoples, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. In northern Manitoba, we acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Inuit and gratefully acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these lands. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We have a quick housekeeping note. Today's session will be professionally recorded for archival purposes. And while the speaker and content will be captured, please note that the audience will not be visually recorded. However, it's possible that voices may be picked up in the recording. So I hope you're comfortable with that. I was also asked to tell you that the parking is free unless you want to make a donation to CHI, and Gillian will collect them, or Carly will collect the money at the end. This evening we're going to hear from Dr. Gillian Mandich on happy leaders. Dr. Mandich is an award-winning, internationally recognized happiness researcher, speaker, educator, and author. She's the founder of the International Happiness Institutes of Health Sciences Research associate at the World Database of Happiness, co-lead investigator of the Canadian Happiness at Work study, and was recently named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mandich.
Good evening. Who wants to be happy? I think on a cold, snowy night like this, probably a good topic, right? Well, thank you for all venturing out. I know sometimes in the winter we want to hibernate, right? But my promise to you is that no matter how happy or unhappy you're feeling right now, by the end of our time, you will have actual, tangible, evidence-based tools and strategies that you can apply to be happier. Sound good? Just one housekeeping thing too. I'm not going to break through the session, so we'll just carry out. So if you need to leave, grab some more food, use the washroom, anything like that, just feel free. There will be a couple times where we stop for like a little small group discussion at the table, but we won't have a formal break. We'll just go right through because I have a lot of content for you. So here we go. I had a lovely introduction, so I'll skip that. I have no disclosures to disclose, So I taught at Western. I'm from London, Ontario. I live in Toronto now. I flew in yesterday. And I taught in the Faculty of Health Science at Western for 4 years. And so the professor in me can't not make like an overview slide. So here we go. What we're going to talk about is the science of happiness. So we're going to break down some of the research. What does it say? What do we know? And then we're going to spend a little bit of time what I call rethinking happiness. Because when I first started studying happiness, it was almost like I had to like unlearn and relearn things that I didn't realize I knew. I'll explain what I mean. And then we're going to get into some tools and strategies in terms of mindset and in terms of leadership. Does that sound good? Okay. So my promise to you, I don't know if any of you follow Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist at Wharton. He posted this picture. My promise to you is this will not be tonight. It says, before corporate training, I'm going to eat you. After corporate training, I'm going to eat you, Steve. It won't be that, okay? I promise. Before we actually get into it, though, I think it's really important that we acknowledge where we're at, right? Because it's pretty hard right now. What we're seeing, and this is Canadian data, is that about 3/4 of Canadians have felt burnt out at some point in their career. And right now in Canada, about 1/3 of Canadians are feeling that. So you may be, or someone you know, but we're definitely seeing those rates. And about half of people feel that they can't really balance the demands of their work and their personal life. I think coming out of the pandemic and now into this, like there's a lot going on. And And there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And uncertainty is a particularly problematic situation. This is one of my favorite research studies, and I can't believe this got through ethics, but it did. Researchers brought participants into a lab, and they had an iPad with a picture of a rock. And then when you click the rock, if there was a snake underneath, you got a shock, like an electric shock. And so there was two different conditions in the study where one of them, eventually, it was sort of they could figure out the pattern. So once they figured it out, they could start to avoid the shocks. So a predictable condition. And then the other condition was completely random. So very unpredictable and like not shocking research finding at all. But what they found is that when we are stressed, the most stressed is when things are uncertain. So if you're feeling stressed, it's hard, right? Because we can't navigate and control. It makes sense. But then the question becomes, okay, well, especially as a leader, like what do you do, right? If you are having to navigate through the situation, and it is what it is, how do we navigate that in the best way possible? And so there's a lot of different areas that we can focus on. But tonight, for our talk, we're going to focus on one thing that we can do, which is look at the science of happiness. Because I think one of the silver linings of being in an uncertain time is that we actually have a chance for change. Like, I don't know if you have experienced this, but I've heard from a lot of people that during the pandemic, things that were good are almost doing better now. And things that were broken or a little bit are just like not working at all, right? It almost became like an amplifier both ways. But whenever we sort of have these situations, what we do is we actually have an opportunity to change things, right? Because the way that was going maybe didn't work that well all the time. It's kind of like this. This is a photo I took in a hotel that I was staying at one time. And do we see the problem? So this is what I mean. If someone told you, okay, you need to build a bathroom, you'd be like, okay, Gillian, this is what I need. I need a toilet, I need toilet paper, a toilet paper holder, I need a sink, and you'd build a bathroom, right? And then you end up with this. So sometimes even though all the ingredients are there might be an area of opportunity to do things better. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And the reason I'm sort of tying in the science of happiness is, one, it's my area of research, but it's a really cool area where we can focus to actually see some differences. And it's so funny. A lot of times when I tell someone I'm a happiness researcher, they kind of like look at me funny and like wonder if I have a real job, because a lot of people don't know you can study happiness. I didn't even know you could study happiness until the second year of my PhD. So my research background is actually childhood obesity. And when I was in the second year of my PhD, I was having an existential crisis, as we do in grad school, right? And I was sort of with obesity, especially childhood obesity. I'm the oldest of 7 kids in my family. And I have, at the time, I had 3 nieces, and they were not living with obesity. And I always thought my work will never help my nieces. And also with obesity, in order to be in one of my studies, you had to have a BMI, a body mass index, above the 85th percentile for the age and gender. And so essentially, I'm using a number on a scale to determine if I can help a child. And so I was like, oh, what am I doing? And then it's like, okay, just like get through grad school. But like grad school is expensive and there's a lot of work and a lot of time. And so I really wanted to do something I loved. And so I was at Pilates one day, where all good things happen. And that my Pilates teacher had 2 reformers. And so the reformer beside me, there was a prof from Ivy, the business school at Western. And she was like, Gillian, maybe you should consider switching to Ivy. We have a health section there. Maybe it's a better fit. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then she made this like off comment. I don't know if this ever happened to you, where someone like makes an off comment they don't remember saying to you and it changes your life. She says to me, she said, or maybe you should check out my sister's research. She's out east in New Brunswick and she studies sustainable happiness. And I was like, what's that? And so she said, go home and look it up. And so I did, and I will tell you why that research was so compelling. I'm going to share it with you in a second. But I have to say that the number one question I get asked when someone tells me I'm a happiness researcher is they're like, what's the secret? What's the secret to happiness, right? What's the magic pill? And the truth is, there's no secret to happiness, but there's a science to it. So just like we can apply scientific principles to learn about cardiovascular disease, diabetes, nutrition, we can learn about happiness. Now, for extra happiness tonight, this is a picture of my dog, Jocko. And I was here in April, I believe, in Winnipeg. And I did a talk, the Department of Pediatrics, for their annual retreat. And as a thank you for my speaker gift, I got this beautiful jacket for my dog. It says the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health in Manitoba. So I just wanted to show you that because my dog's not with us. He's back in Toronto, but in Toronto, he also represents for Manitoba, so in the university. And there's more Jocko photos coming because dogs make us happy. Okay, so I don't have a lot of graphs, but in terms of actual peer-reviewed research on happiness, it wasn't really up until about the mid-90s that we started to see a big increase in this work. So it's sort of mind-boggling when we think about it that up until fairly recently, we were focused on disease, what's wrong, not how do we live our best life. And so the good news and the exciting news, if you look at that graph, is like, look at the slope of the line in the past 20 years, right? So we are seeing this huge increase in the work around happiness, in the scientific work. One caveat to this entire conversation tonight is that we are gonna have a North American conversation, because one thing that we also see is that happiness is different globally, and it is something that it's not the same across the world, but because we live in North America, we're going to focus on that. But the exciting thing, and what you can see in this graph, is that whether we're looking at Western countries or non-Western countries across the world, we are seeing a big increase in the research around happiness, which I think is really exciting. So here's Jocko, he's back again. He's a curious guy. And he wants to know how you define happiness. Because it's interesting, right? Like a lot of times at the beginning of a talk or beginning of a research study, right, we define our terms. I didn't have to define happiness for anyone here. We all sort of have a general understanding of what it is, right? But if I was to go around and poll every single person and ask you to define happiness, we'd have different answers, right? It's kind of interesting. And then it gets more complicated because we look at like media, social media, we hear things like happiness is yelling bingo, right? We've heard that. This is a Coke ad. And it says, if you open Coke, you open a happy can. Although I looked outside, they don't have smiles on them here. And if you're not a Coke person, you're a Pepsi person, that's okay. They weigh in on it too. They say happiness is a choice. Hashtag just so you know. This is a photo I took in New York City. And it says, happiness is crispy tacos arriving just as you walk through the door. It's pretty good, right? Nutella weigh in on it. They say you can't buy happiness, but you can buy Nutella. And that's kind of the same thing. Wendy's disagree. They think it costs 99 cents on their super value menu. And this, I actually found you can get a coin on eBay for $4.99 that says, Manitoba is happiness. And by the way, the shipping for the coin was like $7. So it actually cost more for the shipping than the coin. So essentially, defining happiness is about as easy as following this road sign here, right? Now, that's all well and good until you study it, because as we all know, what do you have to do at the beginning of a research study? You have to define your terms, right? You have to make it very clear what you're studying. And so this is the definition that I use. It's commonly used in literature. It comes from Dr. Sonia Lyubomirsky. She's one of the most published in terms of number of publications of happiness in the world. She's out in California. And the definition that she uses and that I use is that happiness is the experience of joy, contentment, and positive well-being combined with a sense that our life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. So essentially, there's two parts to happiness, right? There's how you're feeling in the moment, and then there's sort of the overall how you're feeling in sort of on life, looking back, that kind of thing. Now, remember I was telling you that I started researching happiness because I got that mention at Pilates, right? And so because I was in health science, when I was looking in PubMed, I started looking at happiness and health, right? And so some of the data that I found were things like this. What we saw is that when we compare happy people to less happy people have better self-reported health. They have less illness, less disease, slower disease progression, increased lifespan, and health span, so number of years that you live and the number of healthy years that you live. And they tend to engage in healthier behaviors from sleep, nutrition, even things like wearing seatbelts and wearing sunscreen. So different safety behaviors. So we see that a lot of things that we want in terms of health promotion are increased when we're happier. And also, this is an interesting study. This was done before the pandemic. Researchers actually exposed people to the rhinovirus, and then they quarantined them for 5 days, and then they measured who got sick. And what they found was that the happier people that had been exposed to the rhinovirus were less likely to get sick than they're less happy people. So I think cold flu season, one of the best things we can do, right? Let's focus on happiness. But it even goes beyond, like, because I looked at it through the health lens, then when you started going even beyond that, what we see is in the workplace, there's a lot of positive outcomes. So we see that a lot of the good things that we want in the workplace are increased when we're happier. So we see things like productivity, job satisfaction, being a better leader, better customer service, being promoted more often. So a lot of the things that are good, we're like, oh wow, they go up. And then some of the things we want to go down, we see that too. So safety, turnover, sick leaves, even health-related claims. And if you want to bring it down into dollars, we can do that too. And what we see is that people that are happier tend to make more money, get raises more often. And even when you look in sales, happier salespeople produce better sales. So even if you want to bring it down to numbers, that's something that we can do. And this is actually a quote from Dr. Daniel Kahneman. He is a Nobel laureate, and he's an economist. And he says, business is more about emotions than most business people care to admit. And so understanding that, I think it's a really important piece, but we don't even just see the benefits in our workplace. It actually extends into our personal life. So what we see is that happier people are less stressed, they're more resilient, they're more generous, they're more altruistic, they're more motivated, they're more creative, they have happier friendships, happier marriages. So all of this to say that focusing on happiness, which feels good, right? It feels good when we're happy. Doesn't just feel good though. There's a lot of positive benefits that really do extend beyond that. And it even goes more than that. This is research out of the UK, published in the British Medical Journal. And what we see that our happiness actually spreads 3 degrees from us. So when we focus on our happiness, not only do we see some of the benefits that I just mentioned, but it also affects the people that we meet and then the people that they meet. So you almost see this sort of like ripple or halo or butterfly effect when we focus on our happiness. Now, Jocko's full grown now, and he's still curious, and he wants to know, okay, well, can we actually increase our happiness? And it's a fair question, right? Because how many of you know someone like this, like the Eeyore type people, right? I'm not just a happy person, glass is half empty. So the question becomes, okay, well, are we just born a certain way, and that's what it is? And when we actually look at happiness research in its infancy stages, like back in the 90s, a lot of people thought that, like almost like we had a set point, and then we kind of went back to that after good or bad things happened. But what we know now is that in terms of our total capacity for happiness, there's sort of 3 big players. So genetics play a big role. So you can thank your parents or not, but it is what it is. But the conversation doesn't end there. So our environment also plays a pretty big role. And the third piece is the piece that's up to us. So that's our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. And so all of my work has always focused on that piece because it's the most amenable to change. Now, remember when I showed you the graph of scientific publications, how there was mid-90s and then it started to go up, the slope increased a lot? One of the main reasons that happened was because there was a field of psychology that was founded called positive psychology. And the founder of positive psychology, his name is Martin Seligman, and this is a quote from him. And he says, "The very good news is that there's quite a number of internal circumstances under your voluntary control. And if you decide to change them, none of these changes come without real effort. Your level of happiness is likely to increase lastingly." Now, I put that part in green. None of these changes come without real effort because that's the key piece of this. You know, like sometimes you see those quote cards on like Facebook or Instagram and it says like, choose happy, or like t-shirts, right? And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. It's not like you wake up in the morning and you like choose your outfit and then you choose happy, right? It actually requires work most of the time. But the cool thing is that when we actually do put in that work, what we see is that we can actually change our long-term happiness. So there is something that we can do beyond just having a boost in the moment. And it doesn't even take that long. So this is data from my PhD. I worked with undergraduate students at Western. And what we did, it was an educational intervention that was 4 weeks long. So every week for 4 weeks, they watched YouTube videos that taught them different skills, like we're going to talk about later, and we measured their happiness. And in even 4 weeks, it was 4 weeks long, we saw a statistically significant increase in the happiness of the students. And I think this is really important because I did a study with the Canadian Mental Health Association. We did data collection in January and February of 2020. Yeah. And then we were planning on releasing all the data on March 20th. It's the International Day of Happiness. And I'm like the happiness expert on like all the shows. And so I leveraged like every media connection I had to be on every show on March 20th, 2020 to talk about happiness in the workplace. And then I think in Toronto, our lockdown was like 16th or 17th or something. I call one of my co-investigators and I'm like, what are we going to do? Like, we can't talk about this because no one has workplace and nobody's happy. So the data I'm sharing is pre-pandemic. We're actually going to do a second follow-up time point shortly to sort of see what's changed. But even back then, pre-pandemic, what we saw is that less than half of Canadians were feeling physically and mentally healthy. And so this is a huge area of opportunity that we can actually do something about. And we're going to talk about that. But first, I wanted to spend a couple minutes doing what I call rethinking happiness. Because so often we think this, right? Like, I will be happy when, fill in the blank, right? I will be happy when I have X amount of dollars, when I get married, when I get divorced, whatever it is. It's a very natural thing, right? I even caught myself when I was editing my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, thinking, I will be happy when I finish writing a PhD about happiness. And so it's a very normal thing that we think, and yet happiness is not a destination, right? It's not something that we find. It's not something that we arrive at or that we get it and we have it forever, right? And so if that's not what a happy life is, what does it mean? And so a happy life, what that means is that we have to practice happiness regularly. And you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that kind of sounds like a quote card for social media, right? What does it mean? Fair question. And so Jocko's back to help us understand what I mean. So Jocko here, he just is at the gym working out. He's got his dumbbells. And say Jocko had the best workout of his life. Or say tomorrow you go to the gym or whatever physical activity you like to do and you have the best workout of your life. Would you ever leave and then take your phone and text your partner or your friend and be like, I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness? Would anyone send that text? No, right? Because why? It sounds silly. Because we understand that if we want to be fit and healthy, what do we have to do? Oop, drop your phone. We have to move our body on a regular basis, right? Or say tomorrow for breakfast, you have this green smoothie. I make this green smoothie. And I put like all the superfoods in it. Would you drink the smoothie and say to me, oh, thank you, Gillian, that was so good. I've reached nutritional wellness. No, right? Because what's going to happen? Lunchtime's going to roll around and we're going to be hungry again. We understand that we need to eat often for our entire life if we want to live, right? So what I mean about practicing happiness regularly is that instead of seeing happiness like a destination, seeing it as something that we have to arrive at one day, if we see it as a practice, if we see it the same way we see nutrition or the same way we see physical activity, then it starts to change the conversation. Because now, instead of having our happiness be contingent on something that may or may not happen in the future, we've brought it into, okay, today, what is something I can do? And we're going to talk about some of those things that you can do. But first, I have a question, not Jocko this time, but me. So if you're having a bad or off day, how do you stay positive? Anyone brave enough want to share? What was that?
Share with colleagues.
Share with colleagues. Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I'll tell you. Oh, thank you.
Something I'm grateful for.
Ooh, you're going to like later in my talk. Thank you. I'm grateful you shared. My answer, you don't. Because when I first started studying happiness, I was going, and oftentimes we do research, right? A lot of times it's something that's personally interesting to us. And so at the time when I switched from obesity to happiness, you start asking yourself questions, right? Like, Gillian, are you as happy as you possibly could be, right? And I was going through a divorce at the time, so I think we can all guess what my answer was, right? So no, and I thought, okay, I'm like this naive grad student who thought that the plan would be that I'm going to study happiness, and I don't like feeling sad, I don't like feeling anxious, I don't like feeling depressed, so I'm going to study happiness and just figure out how to be happy all the time. Sounds like a pretty good plan, right? And so turns out when you look at the research, we can't be happy all the time. And being happy all the time is not actually even the goal. Sometimes in literature, we see what's referred to as like the dark side of happiness, where people who try to be happy all of the time end up being less happy than other people. And when I first read that research, I thought, like, how can that be, right? Like, if I'm setting a goal, even if I don't reach it, like, at least I'm trending in the right direction, right? You think about like weight loss or something. Say you don't get the number that you want, but you're kind of closer. But then I thought about it some more, and I thought, okay, what happens when we don't reach our goals? If someone was to take like a mic and put it in our head, right? The way we talk to ourselves, it's not nice, right? We're very critical, we're very hard on ourselves. And so one, because it's impossible to be happy all the time, then we've now set an impossible goal. And so two, it's like we're just chasing something that we're never going to reach, right? So that's a very important thing, is knowing that we can't be happy all the time. And then this sort of extension of that is what's called toxic positivity. Has anyone ever been told to like turn your frown upside down? Did your frown turn upside down? No. Has anyone ever said to you, like, oh, just keep your head up, right? Or look on the bright side. Toxic positivity is when we reject or we deny stress or negativity and things. But the reality is that we can't just not feel some of those more difficult or challenging emotions, right? And we're humans and we have them. And if we try to bottle them up or push them down, has anyone ever tried to do that? Does it work? No, right? What we see is that emotional suppression, right, where we push things down, it doesn't actually make those emotions go away. They actually get stronger. We call this amplification. And so it's not about trying not to feel those things. It's really about embracing a spectrum of emotions because we're humans and we have that. This is for all the Schitt's Creek fans out there, right? You know how on Facebook you can pick your emotion that you want to respond to something? Wouldn't it be great if we had that button? Yeah. But it's about giving ourselves the grace to be human. And if we're having a day when we're not feeling happy, if we know that we're not supposed to be happy all the time, or we don't have to pretend to be happy, then it gives us grace to be humans and compassionate to ourselves, right? This is a quote from Dr. Susan David. And she says that it's actually normal, healthy, and a good thing to experience the full range of the emotional experience. And so if we know, okay, we can't be happy all the time. We don't want to pretend to be happy. Because have you ever tried to pretend to be happy? It's way more exhausting, isn't it? Yeah. So before we get into what we actually do, I have 2 more questions, but they're not that hard, don't worry. The first one, we're going to answer in our head. If we were on Zoom, we could have put it in the chat box, but we're in person, which is amazing. So the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you right now? So just take a second, check in, and then, and by the way, this is a awareness activity, not a judgment activity. And because there's a lot of smart people in this room, yes, you may use decimal places. As many as you want. Okay, does everyone have an answer? Good, that wasn't too hard, right? Okay, next one's a little bit harder, but it's multiple choice. So say you won $10K today, you won $10,000 in the lottery. And I said to you, congratulations, you've just won $10K. And what I'd like you to do is to spend your $10K in a way to maximize your happiness. And there are 4 choices of how you can spend that money, okay? So A, you can go out and do a home renovation or get a new wardrobe. B, you can take a trip wherever you want to go, wherever you feel safe to, probably somewhere warm if we're coming from Winnipeg, right? But wherever you want to go. C, you budget about $200 a week for self-care. So whatever you like, if you like to order food, get massages, go to Jets games, whatever you like to do, get flowers, you get $200 a week for a year. Or D, you can donate all of your money to your favorite charity, okay? So let's see, show of hands. Who here thinks A, home reno or wardrobe? You're like, Gillian, you've never lived through a home reno, right? It's true. B, trip. I shouldn't be asking about a trip in January in Canada, right? C, self-care, $200 a week. D, charity. Couple philanthropic people over here, that's nice. Yeah. Why not? Okay, so you're probably like, Gillian, what's with all the questions and what's the answer, right? Fair enough. So the answer is C, $200 a week, a year for self-care. And the reason I ask both those questions is because what we know from research is that we're pretty good at self-reporting our own happiness. So we're pretty good at figuring out how happy we are. So whatever number you just came up with in your head, if I was to use, oftentimes in research we use questionnaires to assess happiness, and then we score it, we get a number. If I was to administer a questionnaire to you right now, chances are whatever came from that result would be very close to what you thought of in your head. So we're pretty good at figuring out how happy we feel, self-reporting it. But what we're not as good at is figuring out what it is that makes us happy. So we often think it's when we get the new car or the new wardrobe, or we renovate the house, or we go on the trip, right? Or we do this one big thing for a charity in the day, that brings us the most amount of happiness. But the reason that $200 a week for self-care is the answer is because if we look at sort of the total amount of happiness, we actually get a lot more happiness if we were to budget $200 a week a year for self-care, because what happens is it creates what we call micro moments of happiness. And so what's exciting about a micro moment is that it's small, but it's manageable. It's something we can do today. And it may not seem that big, right? It's not like you're going on a trip. But over time, those micro moments, they add up. And the cumulative effect of that is actually the most significant in terms of how we can actually impact our happiness and increase it long term, like I talked about. Because what we see is that it's really about the frequency of positive experiences. It's a much better predictor of your happiness than is the intensity. So you have your one amazing trip, which, by the way, most trips, they usually have problems, right? But let's just say you have the best trip. Even with that, the frequency of that, you're better off in terms of getting more happiness to have more frequent, smaller bursts. The other thing that happens, what we call a micro moment can create an upward spiral of positive emotion. So I think we're probably more familiar with like downward spirals, right? Where you like have a thought and then like all of a sudden the world is ending or like you're dying, right? The spirals go the other way too. And so it's like if you ever, received a nice email where someone said something really nice about you, and then the next email you reply to, like you're a little bit friendlier, right? That's the upward spirals where it starts to sort of shift our mood in a positive direction. The thing is, these micro moments, it's not like it's life-changing, right? It's like a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. But over time, those little bits, when you look back, are actually quite significant. It's kind of like, this is a picture of the iPhone from first generation to the sixth. I really need to update this graphic because I think we're like 15 now. But every time the iPhone comes out, the camera gets a little bit better, right? It gets a little bit sharper. These small changes, generation to generation, don't seem that big, although Apple might think that it does. They want us to believe it does. It doesn't, right? But then when you look back, you're like, oh, wow, a lot of changes happened. And so that's what happened. It's almost like these micro moments are like reps. Like if you think about happiness like a muscle, right? If I want to get stronger, I'm going to go to the gym. And actually, I went to the gym here in Winnipeg yesterday. So the gym that I go to in Toronto, Altea, their first ever club was here in Winnipeg. So when I landed, I went to my gym. So say I went to Altea yesterday or today, and I want to get stronger. I'm going to lift weights, right? I'm going to do, let's say I want to get like bicep curls. One bicep curl isn't really going to make a difference, but if I consistently do it over and over, what happens? My muscle gets stronger, right? And that's how happiness works. And so what happens is over time, as we have these micro moments, think about them almost like a rep for a muscle, then our happiness increases. Now, you might be looking at this highly scientific graph on the screen, and you may be like, okay, I get it. Over time, if I do that, my happiness goes up, but there's still red faces there, right? And I think the other really important piece of this is that a happy life doesn't mean that there's no challenges in life, right? A happy life doesn't mean that hard things don't happen, that difficult things don't happen, that job losses don't happen, pandemics don't happen, divorces don't happen, health issues, anything. Some of us may be going through some of those things right now, right? A happy life doesn't mean it's free from all of those things. What happens is that as you start to get stronger, your happiness muscle starts to grow. Over time, when those hard things happen, we are more capable and more resilient to deal with them. So it's like our highs start to get higher, our lows, they don't go away, but they start to get higher too. And so with that, we are going to talk about tools and strategies. But before we do, what I want to invite you to do, since we've been sitting for a little bit, is find someone, we're going to take about 3 minutes, find someone who's not at your table, so we all have to stand up. And I want you to share with each other either one happy or one fun memory from the holidays or a recent one. So sound good? Okay, I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. Ideal if you find someone you don't know that well, that's even better. But I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to share one memory with each other. And I'll explain why after. I promise there's a reason. Okay. You're like, I want me to get up. Okay. All right, let's hit pause on that. It's fun to talk about fun memories, isn't it? So, I promise I have a reason for why we just did that. But we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first, remember how I told you that our happiness has sort of 3 main components, right? Genetics, environment, thoughts, actions, and behaviors. The 2 pieces that we're going to focus on for the tools and strategies are environment and thoughts, actions, and behaviors, because we can't change our genes, right? Maybe gene expression a little bit, but very hard. So we're going to focus in on both parts. And I think it's important that we actually do, especially when we look at it from a leadership perspective. It's actually one of my all-time favorite research studies. I loved it so much, I talked about it in one of my TEDx talks. In this study, what researchers did was they brought participants into a lab, and then they had 4 different groups. So 2 of the groups were given hedonically positive music to listen to. So like, when you watch like the movies and they have like a happy music at the end, right? So they had to listen to a happy piece of music. And then the other 2 groups, they had to listen to a hedonically neutral piece of music. So just sort of like what you hear at the dentist, right? And so within each group, there was 2 conditions. So some of them were just told, listen to the music and see how you feel. And some of them were told, listen to the music and try to be happy. And then the same instructions for the neutral music. So some of them just listen to the music. Some of them listen to the music and try to be happy, okay? And what they found was that the only condition that actually saw an increase in their happiness was the condition where they had happy music and they tried to be happy. And I think that's important, right? Because our environment matters, right? The environment affected it, but it wasn't enough, right? We actually also, like Martin Seligman said, right, we have to put in the work too. And so we're going to focus on both of those pieces, especially from a leadership perspective, but we're going to start with you as a human, because I believe if we don't start there, it's about as effective as this parking meter. I'll give you a second. Does anyone see a problem with this? So it's great, right? It's got a solar panel on it, but it's indoors. It's underground. So it's like, you can make this amazing solar panel parking meter, but if you don't put it outside, you're kind of missing the mark, right? It's kind of like that bathroom that I showed you earlier, where it's like, we can have those conditions. And I feel like if we don't start with ourselves with happiness, we're sort of like that, where we're becoming the solar panel parking meter. And so that's what we're going to zoom in on. I think especially because when we look from a leadership perspective, right? We all want to be the leader that's like has a joy-filled life and everyone wants to work for them and you're just a great friend and you exercise and you meditate and you cold plunge or whatever it is that you do, right? But the reality is that like life is not like that. And we're, like I talked about earlier, right? We're seeing across the board in Canada, we're overwhelmed, we're burnt out, we're afraid we're not going to get the goals that we want, our calendars are messy, we're having challenges within our team, right? And so given that, the reason that we're focusing on ourselves first, and I love this quote, this is from John Wooden, and he said, the most powerful leadership tool you have is your own personal example. And I think that especially as a leader, we're going to get into some things we can do within our teams, but first within ourselves. And so we're going to focus on that thoughts, actions, and behavior piece and really zoom in on mindset, because I think that's really important and a great place to start. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what I call the foundational 3, because I do not think it's news to anyone in this room that we should sleep and eat healthy and move our body, right? We all know this. We all know that information, but sometimes life gets in the way and it gets busy. So I want to acknowledge it because the research is very clear that all 3 of those are very important in terms of our happiness. But we kind of know that. So I want to focus on some different things, but I do want to say 2 things about exercise. So this is actually a quote from Sonia Lyubomirsky, whose happiness definition I shared earlier. And she says that happiness is one of the most effective instant mood boosters. And I think that's important because a lot of the other ones that we're going to talk about are habits, right? It's like the iPhone, like little changes, small reps. But like sometimes it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and we're feeling snarky, right? And so how do we shift our mood instantly? And so moving our body is one of the best ways to do that. We never feel like it. The times when we should move our body is like the time that we're least likely to. But sometimes we just have to force ourselves to do it. Go out for a walk, take 5 minutes, put on a song, have a dance party, whatever you want to do. Because what we see is that even 10 minutes of physical activity can greatly increase our odds of being happy. And what we see in research is that on days that people exercise, they're happier than days that they don't. And by exercise, I mean any kind of movement. Walking is excellent. So we're going to leave those 3 aside. We know that they're important, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is what we call the negativity bias. So the negativity bias is kind of like pre-installed software. So if you think about, like, when you get a new computer and you open it up and it's got all the programs that are just like auto-loaded on it or whatever, it's kind of like we have this software installed on our brain. And essentially the negativity bias is, say 10 people give you 10 compliments today, okay? And 1 person says 1 bad thing when you go home tonight and you put your head on the pillow. What are you thinking about? The 1 bad thing. And so our brain has a tendency, even in the midst of a lot of positive, to focus in on the negative. And it actually came from a great place because back in the day when we didn't have the modern conveniences that we do, we actually had to be on the lookout for predators a lot of the time, right? But none of us are sitting here tonight worrying that a bear is going to come in and eat us, right? I did a talk in Victoria not too long ago and I said that, and someone's like, that might happen here. So will that happen here? No, right? So with this negativity bias, it's important that we know that it came installed, but just like you can reinstall other software, we can do that. And I'm gonna share how in a second, but first I have a little exercise for us to do. It's really important though that we do this one in our head, okay? Because if we do it out loud, we're gonna confuse the people around us, okay? So here's a paragraph, and I'm just gonna pause and invite you to read it. How'd it go? Pretty good? Wasn't hard, eh? Okay, I know. So does anyone here use Grammarly, the Chrome extension that checks your grammar? Just me? One over here? Okay. I have like I love grammar. I listen to the Grammar Girl podcast. Like I love grammar. And it really bothers me that I can read that because the first and the last letter are the same, but the rest of it's all jumbled. And so why is that? Why could we read that? It's because we think we're like these logical, rational creatures, right? But our brain can play tricks on us, right? And so just like our brain can play tricks and allow that to be read really easily, the negativity bias is another example of a trick that our brain can play on us where we focus on the negative even in the midst of a lot of positive. So I've got one more exercise. And again, we're going to do this in our head. Very good job doing it in your head before, by the way. I say it all the time and then people do it out loud. So thank you. This time it's a little bit different. This time what I want to invite you to do is to say the color, don't read the word. Okay, so say the color, don't read the word. So like the first line is blue, green, is that purple? Purple? Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second, give you a second. Say the color, don't read the word. You probably don't want to do this one out loud. It is tough. Wasn't that harder? Did you guys find that harder? Why is that? The words are spelled correctly here. It's because our brain takes the path of least resistance. So our brain just goes on autopilot all the time. And it wants to just do what it's always done. It's like, have you ever gotten in your car and driven somewhere and you're like, how did I get here? Right? Because our brain just goes on autopilot. And so our brain is going to go on autopilot and revert to the negativity bias unless we actually do something to override it. And so we really want to focus on overriding this brain's negativity bias. And so how do we do that? Well, we do it the same way that we did accomplish this task. So in order to accomplish this task, what did you have to do? Slow down, take your time, focus, right? And so if we want to not focus on the negative, what we have to do is do the same thing. Slow down, start to put more intention and effort into focusing on the good. It's what I call like don't seek, like S-E-E-K, happiness, but see happiness. We actually have to start to notice that. We have to start to intentionally look for good because our brain wants to go on autopilot and look for the bad. The good news is what we know from the psychology of behavior change is that change gets easier, right? We get used to it over time. So over time, we actually start to see more good. Now, again, this kind of looks like another quote card we could put up on social media, right? Like, don't seek happiness, see happiness. But the reality is life's kind of like a Where's Waldo book, right? Remember Where's Waldo? It's just there's a lot going on. We have a lot to focus on. And so how do we actually focus on the good? By the way, Waldo is right there. And so we actually have to put effort and intention into doing it, into actually actively starting to see and become aware. A lot of times people will say to me, okay, Gillian, like, how do I be happier? And my answer is always like, okay, before we actually start doing more things and adding to our list, let's appreciate the good that we have in our life right now, right? Let's start to actually notice some of those good things before we even start to go beyond that. It's kind of like because I'm always asking people what makes them happy. I have to say that like one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that before the pandemic, when I'd ask people like, what makes you happy? I would hear things like the trip I just went on, my new promotion at work, my new car or whatever. And then now when I ask people, I'm hearing often things like hugging my mom, going for coffee with a friend, going to a movie theater, right? So a lot of the things that we actually had in our life that actually brought us a lot of joy and happiness, sometimes we almost took them for granted or we didn't even realize it as much, right? Until they were taken away during the pandemic. So moving on, another big one in terms of our mindset is focusing on autonomy. So essentially what autonomy means is that there are certain things in our life that we can control, right? And certain things in our life that we can't control. And so autonomy means understanding that and choosing to give more of our focus, more of our attention, and more of our resources to the things that we can control. And while that sounds good, what we see in terms of happiness is autonomy is actually more of a predictor of our happiness than how much money we have, how attractive we are, how good our sex life is, or how popular we are. So I think we look at that list and be like, yeah, okay, like I see how those things would affect my happiness. But even above all of those things is autonomy, this idea of focusing on what we can control. Now, especially in life, there are sometimes, especially in the workplace and systemic issues, right, where we don't have control. But even still, looking for control is really important. And I'll tell you why in a second. But first, I'm going to share, this is one of the most iconic studies in the happiness space. It was done by a researcher at Yale and one at Harvard. And it was done in 1977. And so in this study, what happened was researchers went into a retirement home. It was actually a 4-story retirement home, and they used 2 of the stories for two of the floors, pardon me, for the study. And so one floor was like the control. So just status quo, business as usual. The second one, what the researchers did was they gave the patients there control over seemingly like things that didn't really matter. So like, do you want a plant in your room, yes or no? Which plant do you want? Here's some to choose from. Or like, what movie do you guys want to watch? What movie do you want to watch on Tuesday night? So these things that are seemingly don't really matter, right? But it's an area of control in an environment where they don't have a lot of control. And what we found is that the participants that were in the condition where they had the little bits of autonomy, they had more health, had more vigorous activity patterns, they were more actively interested and engaged, they were more social, their mood didn't decline as greatly, and their mortality rate was half of the other condition. So yes, sometimes we think about autonomy, we think about like the big things, right? But then also looking at some of those smaller things, like if you're meeting with someone, instead of saying, let's meet at 10, it's like, what time do you want to meet this morning? Like things like that, where it doesn't seem like a lot. What we see is that perceived autonomy is really big. And you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that's really cool, but like that was done in 1977, right? Well, the good news is that there was a review that came out in 2021, and it looked at, I think, 86 other studies that replicated this finding. And what they found was that perceived autonomy promoted both health and quality of life. So asking for ourselves and for the people we're with, like where can we create some of those things, right? Where can we create opportunities for more autonomy? And so 2 things that we can do to do that is, number 1, it's what I call check your lens. So what do you see on the slide right now? You can just yell it out. Faces? A vase? Vase? Yeah. So it's interesting, we're all looking at the same slide, right? But we all didn't see the same answer. A chess piece, there we go. I like the creativity. So the lens that we look at matters. If we focus on the black parts of this slide, we see 2 faces. And if we focus on the white parts, then we see a vase or a chess piece, right? So depending on what we focus on, we actually see something different. The lens that we look through it matters. We're now starting to get some good data coming out of the pandemic, but we don't really have it yet. But what we do, I think we can all agree that the pandemic was a stressful time, yes? And so, although not the same, similar, if you were a banker in 2008, that's a pretty stressful time too. Remember the financial crisis in 2008? So we have some good data from that. So in 2008, some researchers went and they studied bankers during the financial crisis. And like, not shocking information, they found that a lot of them were really stressed out. But they also found that there was a subgroup that was actually fairly happy and resilient even during the stressful time. And so the researchers thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what these people have in common. Do they have something in common, right? Or are they just naturally born to be more resilient? And so they did a follow-up study. And what they did was they studied those happier, resilient bankers. And they found that there was only one factor that was different between them and the stressed out bankers. And it wasn't things you may think, like education level, years of experience, things like that. The only difference between the 2 groups was that the happy, resilient bankers, they didn't see a problem as a threat. They saw it as a challenge to overcome. So the same situation, the lens that they had was different, right? So think about it. If you see something as a challenge, how do you approach it, right? You're like, okay, let's figure this out. What do we need to do? But if you see something as a threat, then what happens, right? You go on the defense, you get, right? So the lens that they saw it through was different. So then the question is, okay, well, were they just wired that way? Are they wired differently, right? Is that they were just sort of born that way? And so then they did another study. And what they did was they showed the stressed out bankers a video, an educational video, that explained how to see something as a challenge as opposed to a threat. And after just watching that video, which essentially is exactly what we just talked about now, they saw a 23% drop in their stress. They saw an increase in their happiness and an increase in their work engagement. So this is something that we can control, right? The lens that we see something through. So that is one area of opportunity. The other one, and I'm telling you this one as someone who works in media, okay? But it's important. Did anyone turn on their TV today and see something like this? It says, breaking news, local stingray in great mood. The water is nice and warm and its flappy parts feel very flappy indeed. Anyone see anything like this on TV? No, right? I was on CP24 on Monday and I watched, like, you know how on CP24 they have like the weather and the stocks and the thing? I was watching part of my clip back and it was about like how to have a happy 2024 and like underneath the stories were terrible. And I'm like, that's not happy, right? Because the news is much more doom and gloom than we see, right? We look at social media, right? This guy's saying, I can't talk right now. I'm simulating happiness on Facebook, right? Because we can choose how we want to feel even if we're not with social media. I saw this the other day. It says being famous on Instagram is like winning in Monopoly. Because social media is not real, right? And so even though it's not real, what is real is it affects how we feel and our mood. So what we see is that people that watched just 3 minutes of news that they perceived to be negative, they had a 27% greater likelihood of reporting their day as unhappy 6 to 8 hours later. So it's not just a question of turn it on, turn it off, go about your day. Really, when we think about the residue of that, it matters. And when we think about areas that we do have control, I'm not saying we need to live in like a bubble and not have anything going on, but like, do we need to have CNN on the back? One of my aunts has like CNN on in like every room in her house. And I just like go and want to escape Anderson Cooper, right? We don't need to have that on in the background. Or like if you're driving and you're listening to your car, what are you listening to, right? Or I live in a condo building and I'll catch myself like taking my phone out of my pocket and starting to scroll without really even realizing I got my phone out, right? So a lot of times it's just, we're not aware of it. And that's something that we do have control of. I don't need to scroll social media for 15 seconds while I wait for the elevator, right? But yet it's something, again, that we have to really focus on. And the reason that we do is because it matters. So doing things like having clear goals, like am I going on social media just to waste time? Or am I going to see what my family's up to? Or what's the point, right? And also, I don't know if Androids are the same, but for sure for iPhones, it'll tell you how much time you spend on your phone. Have you ever checked that? Right? So scheduling time, making sure that we have those boundaries. And then this is a big one, is not going on first thing in the morning, right? Our morning is so important because it sets the tone for the rest of our day. And as soon as we take our phone, what's happened, we've lost control over how we're going to feel because we don't have control over what we're going to see, right? And so taking that time, it's really important. Now, another thing we can do in terms of our mindset is what I call hinder hedonic adaptation. And so what hedonic adaptation is essentially we get used to things over time. As humans, we're adaptive creatures. So it's sort of like if you ever get a new car, right, and your happiness goes up, and then over time you kind of get used to it, even if it's like a great new car. It's sort of like, you get your new car and it's like pristine. And then if you were to go in like a month later, there's like garbage in your car, right? We get used to it. Or it goes that way, but it also goes the other way, When we have a heartbreak or, something like that or a loss, we feel, especially with like a heartbreak, right? We feel like we're never going to feel happy again. But then over time, we slowly start to get better. That's hedonic adaptation. It goes both ways. And so the Rolling Stones were actually wrong. It's not about getting satisfaction, it's about how do we keep it, right? Because we get that initial boost, but how do we actually slow the curve of adaptation so that we have a greater area under the curve so that we get more happiness from the same event, right? So 2 things that we can do for that. One is introduce variety. You know how I said earlier, there's no secret to happiness, but there's a science to it? Well, this quote, this is from Dan Gilbert. He's at Harvard, and he disagrees with me. He says, the secret of happiness is variety. But the secret of variety, like the secret of all spices, is knowing when to use it. And so as humans, what we see is that when we have variety, it can increase the complexity of a situation. It makes things more interesting. It stands out, right? If we see something different, it's more interesting to us. And so what we see is that when we have more variety, we actually get more happiness. And so this is something where, okay, it's easy to do. because we're creatures of habit, so we have to interrupt that. So even where do you park and how do you walk into a building, right? What route do you take to work? Where are you getting your dinner from all the time? All of these things that we do habitually, like do you go to the same coffee shop all of the time or do you go to different places, right? So looking for areas where you are sort of in that cycle where you're habitual and creating different things like that is huge. Now, the other way that we can kind of slow that curve, similar to variety, but not the same, is surprise. So surprise, again, it's interesting and it's novel for our brain. But the problem with surprise is that you can't plan for a surprise, right? Like you can kind of plan if you want to go to a new restaurant, try a new restaurant this week for dinner, right? That's good variety. But you can't plan a surprise because if you plan a surprise, it's not a surprise, right? And so what do? And so although we can't plan for surprises, what we can do is we can put ourselves into situations where more surprises are more likely to happen. And so this is something where, you know, when you go to new places, when you go on vacation, when you take a trip somewhere, when you go visit a different part of the city that you've never been in, when you go into a new museum, I'm going to the, what's it called? Yeah, I'm going there tomorrow. So maybe I'll be surprised. So putting yourself in situations where it's more likely to happen is key. Now, so I did the opening plenary for the American Society of Addiction Medicine in Washington, D.C. in May. So it's cherry blossom season, so I got to go see the cherry blossoms. That was variety. And then I try when I speak and I travel to like at least make an effort to go see one thing, like I'm going tomorrow morning, right? And so I had never been to D.C. and I wanted to obviously go see like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, right? The White House. And so I went with a couple psychiatrists from CAMH, and we went the next day. And so we see the Lincoln Memorial, and then we walk up to the Washington Monument, and then we want to take a photo. And so say the Washington Monument's directly in front of me. If you look to the left, you can see the White House. And then we were taking a photo, but the sun was like, so we had to put our back to the White House to take the photo. And so we take the photo, and then I turn around, and I look at the White House, and this is what I saw. It's a giant Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle walking by the White House. And then I look at one of the psychiatrists and he just looks directly at me and he's like, element of surprise. And I was like, yes. So again, you can't plan to see a Ninja Turtle walking by the White House, but you never know, anything's possible. It turns out in DC, they have a cherry blossom parade. And it just happened to be that day at that time. So this Ninja Turtle was part of the parade. So with that, so we sort of covered 5 different things in terms of our mindset, things for us. And I think, like I said, that's like the solar panel parking meter, where we need to sort of make sure that we focus on us first before we start going out, especially as a leader. And then once we do that, where do we go from there? And so now we're going to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about leadership. Because I think especially when we are a leader, one, we need to focus on ourselves, but also it's important to think about what are some things that we can do. And so we're going to discuss a couple. And the first one, I really wanted to start with this because it's huge, is psychological safety. And so you might be thinking, okay, what is that? Or maybe you know. But essentially, psychological safety is the belief that we're not going to be punished, we're not going to be made fun of, we're not going to be humiliated if we speak up, if we have questions, if we make a mistake, that basically our team is safe for us to take risks. And I think it's pretty evident and obvious why that is something that's important in a team, right? But what we see is that when we have psychological safety, employees are more engaged, things are more inclusive in terms of culture in the workplace, we're more creative, we're more innovative, and employee well-being does go up. And so you might be thinking, okay, that's cool, but like, how do you actually determine psychological safety? And so often this is a questionnaire that's used, and it goes through these 7 questions here, asking things like, if I make a mistake on my team, it's not held against me, right? So we have room to make mistakes, or that people are able to bring up a problem or a tough issue. And so when we think about, okay, well, how do we create psychological safety? It's sort of 2 sides to a coin, where one side is creating that space to have people feel safe, right? But then on the other side, the people have to have trust in you that it is safe, right? And the trust piece is really big. What we see is that when employees are trusting, they're 260% more motivated. They have 41% lower absenteeism and 50% less likely to look for another job. And so this is something that's really important. What I'm going to do for a second is just pause, and I'm going to put a question up on the board. And the question is, in this hybrid post-pandemic environment, what key factors have you contributed to trust within your team? And we're going to focus specifically, because we're overriding the negativity bias. We're not going to focus on what didn't happen to not have trust. We're going to focus on the positive side of things that have happened within your team or your organization, or even maybe it's like in your family, but areas where it's contributed to trust. So since we have these cute little U-shaped tables, we'll just do each table as a discussion just for a couple minutes, okay? So I'll give you a 30-second warning, but we'll just take a couple minutes to discuss trust. All right. Is this mic gonna work? Yes. Does anyone want to share what they discussed in their group? Does anyone want to share? Anyone brave enough? It's okay if you don't, but anyone want to share anything? Is anyone trusting enough to share?
I'll volunteer you.
Oh, thank you.
What did you guys say again? Just kidding. One of the first things that we talked about was the ability to work from home and adapting to a more digital environment to have accessibility to not only my colleagues, but also like the leadership team. Mm-hmm. Also, you had mentioned about communication, having like more open communication and being able to foster like a more healthy environment with different aspects of communication or different varieties of.
That's awesome. You could have built my slide deck because you're just foreshadowing what's coming next. So thank you.
I'm just here for snacks.
All right. So when we think about trust, right, some of the things that we can do to help foster and build trust is have clear norms and expectations, right? So things are predictable and fair. If you know why things are happening and why you're doing things, showing appreciation and humility, right? Especially as a leader, we're not perfect. And so sometimes showing that, or maybe going back and saying, this is where I could have done something differently too, right? Starting to create that environment. Making it clear why it's important that everyone's voice matters and why you want to hear that so that they know. And also sometimes actively inviting some input and feedback, right? Because if we just wait for people to come to us, sometimes if you ask the question, they may not have come to you, but you can have that kind of dialogue. So just for you, next we're going to talk about connection, because this is a really big one. So this is Waldo is sitting at a bar here. I know. So nobody ever asks, how's Waldo? And so I know. The thing is with connection, what I'm talking about isn't just like the, hey, how are you? I'm fine conversation with the cashier at the grocery store. It's like, actually, how are you doing, right? It's asking Waldo, like, how are you doing? What's going on in your life? So it's conversation that's above the just sort of like, oh, the weather kind of thing. Often researchers, when they want to assess connection, what they'll ask, the question they'll ask sometimes in research is, if you had a crisis or an emergency in the middle of the night, is there someone that you could call? And then can they call you? Because the reciprocity piece is key, because if it's only one way, then it's basically a therapy session, right? So you need to have that both way, but it's not like you need to have 5,000 Facebook friends. Often in research, the question is, do you have one? So in terms of happiness, the longest study, longitudinal study that we have looking at happiness was done at Harvard. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and it's been going on for almost 80 years now. So what happened in this study was researchers followed two groups of men, because at the time, only men were going to Harvard, so they studied a group of men at Harvard. And then they also separately, at the same time, studied a separate group of men in a low socioeconomic area in Boston. And like fun fact, if you're ever playing like trivia, John F. Kennedy was one of the guys in the Harvard group. So the researchers take these two groups of men and they follow them through their life, okay? And so as they got married, as they had kids, they started inviting them into the study too. And it's been going on so long that we're seeing the participants are starting to pass away with their children, and things are ongoing in the study. And so the lead author, current, because there's been multiple, because it's been going on for 80 years, the current lead author of this study, his name is Dr. Robert Waldinger. And side note, if you like reading, he had a book come out this year called The Good Life. And I'm not ruining the book by telling you what I'm telling you, but essentially the punchline of the book is exactly what he says here, which he says, the lesson that came from tens of thousands of pages of research was that good relationships keep us happier and healthier. And so above the one thing that he says over and over again when you listen to him on podcasts all the time, the number one predictor of both our long-term health and our happiness is social connection. So above how much money we make, above our education level, above our race, our age, our gender, all of those things, the number one thing is social connection. If you were concerned about Waldo at the bar, I've got great news. He, Carmen Sandiego, and their pet Nemo, they lived happily ever after at an undisclosed location. So Waldo's doing okay. And so what we see in terms of social connection is that we have increased happiness, better health, and even longevity. So the opposite, though, right, of connection, so feeling disconnected, feeling lonely, it actually can be as detrimental in terms of our physical health as alcoholism or smoking. And so what we see is that when we don't have that connection, it doesn't feel good, but it also doesn't have good implications in terms of our physical health, right? I talked about how happiness has all these positive implications. When we're lonely, we see that it can be really detrimental. Remember at the beginning when I was telling you how I was saying happiness is not a destination, it's a practice, right? I did a talk at Lakehead University, a virtual talk during the pandemic. And the professor that invited me, after the talk, we were just chatting on Zoom, and she said, you know, Gillian, like when you were talking about how happiness is not a destination, it's a practice, it reminds me of this photo that I have on my fridge at home. And I was like, oh, okay. She's like, I'm going to send it to you. I'm like, okay. So she sent it to me. This is it. It's from a book. It's called Big Panda, Tiny Dragon. And it says, which is more important, asked Big Panda, the journey or the destination? It says the company, said Tiny Dragon. I actually put it on my fridge too. But I love it, right? Because often it's not even about where we're going. It's about who we're going there with, right? If you're ever, like I know you guys have some gorgeous sunsets here and they're beautiful, but if you watch it beside someone, is it even better? Sometimes, depending who it is maybe. But it's really, we are social creatures and we want to connect with other people and it feels good to connect. And I think especially when we get busy sometimes, that's the first thing that can drop off of our to-do list, right? Is to take time to actually call a friend or go for dinner or go for coffee. And yet it's so important. What we see is that when we feel connection in the workplace specifically, people are more productive, they're more creative, they're more collaborative, they're happier with their jobs. And then when they don't have that, right, when they don't feel that connection, they feel disconnected. What we see is that they don't focus as well, they don't collaborate as well. We kind of know that, right? Like when we feel connected, we actually want to be a part of something. And if we're not like eager to get in there. And so given that, the question is, okay, well, how do we actually build connection, right? And there's a lot of ways to build connection. We're just going to zoom on one for a couple minutes, which you also alluded to earlier, which is about communication. And I picked this one because, like I said, when we did data collection in January and February of 2020, so this is before the whole hybrid remote work situation, right? Only about a third of Canadians got clear and direct feedback about their performance. And only about a quarter felt like there was effective communication within their organization. And now we've added in hybrid and virtual and. Imagine what it is now, right? So communication is so important, especially because sometimes we may think we're being very clear with what we're saying, but it doesn't quite pan out that way, right? It's kind of like this. This is a cake. It says, thanks for a great year in purple. So clearly someone called the bakery, right? And they said, hi, I'd like to order a birthday cake. Thanks for a great year. And put it in the color purple. But the communication, something along the way, something broke, right? So they thought they were calling and being very clear about their cake order. And then this happened. I also saw another cake, had a similar situation. This one was a birthday cake, and it was for a little boy. It was, I think he's French because it says Bona Fetta, but the parent called and said, okay, I'd like to order a cake for my son and put the Leafs on it, right? You guys probably put the Jets, but here, I'm Toronto, right? Put the Leafs on it. So mom goes to pick up the birthday cake. You know what happened? Oh, they said the Maple Leafs, pardon me, like the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? So it says Bona Fetta Jacob. And there's Leafs. But it actually gets better, okay? So this is the good part of this. what happened is the Maple Leafs food now sent Joshua and his family, or Jacob and his family, to a Leafs game. Isn't that nice, right? So being clear with our communication is really important, not only in terms of the cakes that we order, but in terms of everything that we do, especially as leaders. Because what we see is that good communication builds connection. And so when we think about, okay, well, where are some areas of opportunity where we can build connection, right? And so remember earlier I asked you this question. I said, what is a fun or happy memory that you have from your holiday? The reason I did that was because you just connected with somebody and you learned something about them, right? And especially when it's a positive memory, it's something that instantly it builds a little connection. When you know something about someone like that, or you're sharing something that's not like deepest, darkest secrets, but it's something more personal, it really helps to foster connection. And it wasn't like you were having like deep conversations about, like your relationship or hard things that you're going through. And that's okay, because that type of communication, that sort of tell me one fun thing about your holiday, it matters too. Sometimes we hear them referred to as like water cooler moments, right? Where we stop and have a chat. And this is why hybrid in person, that battle that's going on right now, yes, there's a lot of flexibility and it's great, but sometimes it is nice to be with people because we actually can have an in-person conversation that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So often in sort of the workplace, they're referred to as water cooler moments, but in research, we actually call them face-to-face spontaneous conversations. And they can be about either work or non-work, like what you just did. You can have a conversation about something that happened, and it can have a positive impact. You can talk about work. What we see is that face-to-face spontaneous conversations have the greatest impact on idea generation and on team innovation, and that teams could not effectively compensate for the loss of face-to-face with electronic media, email, Zoom, audiovisual, things like that. And so, yes, we need to have that flexibility, and we can probably build in a little bit of perceived autonomy there, but having those areas of opportunity to sometimes have those non-spontaneous conversations, the water cooler moments, is also really key. Another big one in terms of communication is our nonverbals, right? If I just like stood up here like this, more like this, right? It's very different. And so often our body language will tell a story that we don't even realize. Like I can never play poker because I have a terrible poker face, right? Because our nonverbals can give things away. How we're standing, if we're looking people in the eye, all of those things. Because what we see is that when we can actually accurately interpret nonverbal cues, we can actually create more connection because we have an understanding of someone's feelings at a deeper level. And a lot of our communication is nonverbal, right? And when we have that, we can actually feel more connected to others. So, okay, how do we focus on nonverbal communication, right? Well, especially in a virtual world, it means we have to put the camera on. I can totally relate to this dog, by the way. And then we actually make eye contact when we're talking to people. And being mindful of both our body language and the person that we're talking to's body language, and noticing like maybe discrepancies in what they're saying and how they're acting. Or if you're not sure, then just asking, right? Ask them how they're doing. And the last one, this is a big one too, is communication is about talking, but it's also about listening, right? And what we listening skills are crucial to give leaders access to knowledge and to diversity and to help make decisions. And so this is something that often is a major problem. When we think about communication, often we're trying to think about what do we say, not what do we hear. And yet what we see is that about 86% of employees feel that they're not heard fairly or equally. And 63% believe their voice has been ignored. And when an employee actually feels heard, they feel listened to, they're 4.6 times more likely to feel empowered to perform their best. And so when we think about that, okay, well, how do we focus on our listening? Well, focus on the person, right? If we're busy and we're distracted while we're talking to someone, that sends a pretty good message that we're not listening, right? When we're on our phones. I actually was just reading a paper the other day, and it said that if you go out for dinner with someone, the presence of the phone on the table, it impacts the connection and the communication. Not even on the phone, having the phone there and visible. So if we're not paying attention, whether it be distracted by a phone or something else that's going on, it's a pretty good clue that we're not listening. And actively communicating. And if you don't know what someone's saying, ask them. If you're not clear what you heard, ask them. And I think the other key piece is when we're listening, we don't interrupt, right? Because oftentimes when someone wants to speak, we don't even give them a chance to finish. And if you don't get to finish, you definitely don't feel heard, right? So In terms of another thing that we can do when we think about as a leader, how do we lead and what do we do is appreciation. Sometimes it's referred to as gratitude. And what we see is that 50% of people express gratitude to their immediate family on a daily basis, but only 15 do with their colleagues. And in fact, the workplace is the very last place that people are inclined to say thank you. Right? And think about it. We often take who we work with for granted, right? We just take it whatever, but we don't actually show that appreciation. We saw this when we polled Canadians too. We saw that less than half of Canadians were feeling appreciated at work. And yet it's so important because when we feel appreciated, we have more positive emotions, we have less stress, we are less sick. And it doesn't need to be a lot. Like appreciation doesn't need to be like this huge thing. A little bit really does go a long way. So, I think sometimes when we think about appreciation, we think about the big moments, but we don't think about the smaller things day to day. And like I talked about with happiness, those smaller micro moments are really important. But so are they with appreciation and gratitude, because if there's a small thing that's done and someone is recognized for it, you feel seen, you feel heard, you feel appreciated. In meetings, where do we have opportunities for that in one-on-ones? Or what's called a gratitude jar. Has anyone ever heard of a gratitude jar? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a jar with things that people are grateful for. And I was also, when I did the addiction medicine talk in DC, the day before the Ninja Turtle, I was talking about the gratitude jar. And then after my talk, an emergency room physician from Philadelphia came up to me. And she said, Gillian, I loved the gratitude jar thing, and I actually have one, and I have a picture of it I want to show you. So this picture I'm going to post has nothing to do with showing appreciation at work, but it's probably one of the best gift ideas I have ever come across that costs $0. So this is the photo I took of her showing me the phone screen, and I'm just going to read it to you. It says, open this jar once a day to discover 365 reasons we love our mother. Read one each morning to start the day off right, or read one in the afternoon for a wonderful night. We love you so much. You deserve the world and a star, but instead we made you this wonderful jar. And so this is just like a public service announcement that if you need a good gift idea, especially if it's like someone's birthday and maybe you have family and everyone can put in like 10 things, I think it's a really cool way to show appreciation. So that's my free gift idea. That's the bonus for tonight. But the gratitude jar thing is big. And also when I was at that same talk, a couple months later, a colleague of mine, Dr. Peter Selby, he runs an 80-person nicotine lab at CAMH. And I was over there at CAMH one day, and he's like, Gillian, I want to show you something. And I'm like, okay. And he runs over, and he grabs this, and he shows me. And at CAMH, they started a gratitude jar. And so what they do is people can put them in, and then when they start meetings now, they actually pull one out, and they talk about it. So that's just a fun idea. The key thing, when you're writing down or sharing something that you're appreciative or grateful for, the key thing is you have to move beyond platitudes, right? So just saying great job doesn't really help. Like some of these platitudes, like have you heard some of these, like age is just a number, Rome wasn't built in a day, good things come who those two wait. All these platitudes don't mean anything, right? And if you then extend those platitudes to appreciation, it doesn't mean anything. So instead getting really specific, like I really appreciated how you handled this task or whatever it is that you did, but really making it more personal and not so general. If you're gonna make the effort to do it, why not get the most out of it, right? And so the way to do that is to just be really specific and move beyond platitudes. So if you've never practiced gratitude or you've done it many, many times, we're going to just quickly for a minute try it together. Okay, it's a 3-step process. There's many ways that you can practice gratitude, right? I talked about the jar, journals. This is just another way. So we're going to just do it together so we can all try it, okay? So 3 steps. Step number 1 is think of someone who has done something that you really appreciate or felt thankful for. Okay? I'll give you a second. Okay, are we ready for step 2? That wasn't so hard, right? Okay, so this, if you have a phone, you can actually take out your phone in your notes section or whatever. If you have a pen and paper, you can write it on a pen and paper, or if you don't, then you can just mentally write it in your head, okay? But I'm gonna pause for a second. And what I wanna invite you to do is that person that you thought of, think of just 1 to 2 sentences about what they did or why you appreciate them or why you're grateful for them. So I'll give you a minute just to think about that. All right. So technically your gratitude practice can stop there, right? Because what gratitude is taking the time to think about or write down in like a good, better, best situation. It's good to think about things that you're grateful for, but the best thing to do is to write it down, whether that be electronically or with like an actual pen to paper. So step 3 is optional, but step 3 is you actually send that message. How often do we actually take the time, especially the people that are most important in our life, to actually tell them those things? What's really cool about that is sometimes I'll do this activity and then I'll talk to people later and they'll tell me, oh, I sent the message and then this is what happened. So I think sometimes, especially when you do something good or you have something good done for you, pardon me, and you recognize it back, you get a boost in your happiness, but so do they. And so this is where sometimes when I do my gratitude practice at home, if I'm thinking about a person or whatever, I'll try to call them that day or send a message because it's great to think about it, but it's even better if you can actually share that and appreciate that with them. So with that, Professor Gillian's back with her summary slides, and we covered a ton. Thank goodness there's a recording. But we talked about, right, the different ways that we can impact our happiness, starting with our mindset, right? Thinking about things like remembering that we are supposed to sleep, move our body, and that we're supposed to sleep, eat well, and move our body. That we have this pre-installed software, right? Our negativity bias, but we can actually override it by starting to notice things in our life that we're grateful for or appreciate. And autonomy, right? This is a really big one because often, even in the areas where we don't have control, we can look for areas of opportunity for perceived control, plants, start times of meetings, any of those things. It can still have a huge impact. And then we talked about hedonic adaptation, right? The fact that we are just adaptive creatures, but we can slow that curve by introducing variety and surprise. And then we talked about leadership, right? Things that we can do, like creating psychological safety and focusing on connection, looking at things like nonverbals, looking at listening and those spontaneous conversations, and then appreciation. Now, before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to leave you with 2 thoughts. The first thought is a quote that I heard on Tim Ferriss's podcast like 8 or 9 years ago. It was by a gentleman named Derek Sivers. And Derek said, if more information was the answer, we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs. Because it's true, right? I feel like it's good to know all this information. And I've like packed a lot of information here. But when you leave here today and you go outside and you live the rest of your life and you go about your day tomorrow, if you don't actually do anything, right? Martin Seligman said we actually have to actively make change. If you don't do that, then you just have some good information, but nothing's going to change. And because we now know that we can actually increase our happiness, no matter how happy or unhappy we're feeling right now, that we can actually increase it and sustain it at higher levels, but it's up to you, right? To create those micro bursts, to put in the reps, to do that. And the other thing I wanted to leave you with is that I think especially as a leader, remember I talked about how our happiness spreads 3 degrees from us, but our actions and our thoughts really do matter. And they matter for all the reasons that we talked about. And they matter for a reason that was in one of my favorite research studies. So this particular, you know how like it's trendy now to buy coffee for people in line, right? Behind you, the strangers. So in this study, researchers actually studied people in a coffee shop. So they assessed the happiness of the person that bought the coffee. And not surprisingly, what they found was that the person that bought the coffee for a stranger saw a boost in their happiness. Because it's nice to do something nice. It's an element of surprise, too. There's the bonus. It's nice to do something for someone that's a stranger that's unexpected, right? Then they also measured the happiness of the person that received the coffee, that had the coffee bought for them. And they saw a boost in their happiness, too, because it's not surprising, right? If someone stranger buys you a cup of coffee, like you feel good, right? But my favorite part of the study is that the researchers also assessed every other person in the coffee shop. And what they found was that even observing that act, they saw an increase in their happiness. And I think sometimes it's important, right? What we do matters just beyond us. And I think especially when we look at it from a leadership lens, those small things day to day that we're doing, people are seeing that and it's impacting them. So being really conscious and deliberate and aware. And with that, there's one more picture of Mr. Jocko because he's so cute. But we do have a mic, and I would love to answer any questions about anything we talked about or anything else. But before we do, I just want to say, talking about the science of happiness truly makes me so happy. And I'm so grateful for the entire team that invited me and for having me today, because it makes me happy. So thank you all for listening to my chat about the science of happiness. And if any of you had any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I think we have a mic to run, right? Oh, we got one over here.
Thank you, first off, for that wonderful talk. I really learned a lot. And one of the points that you were talking about really stood up to me, and I was just wondering if you could kind of clarify. So I know one of the things we talked about in that very scientific graph that you gave, where it was like the happy face and then the mad face and then the happy face. So part of that discussion was talking about how there are times in our lives where we do need to acknowledge that we're not going to be happy. But then at other points throughout the lecture, you were talking about how we need to work on being happy and like being very focused on, what strategies can we use to be happy and implementing them. So I guess if you could just clarify if there is any research behind this, or is there a difference between times that we need to acknowledge that, okay, we're just in a bad mood, or like we are unhappy and let's just acknowledge that and then move on, versus times that we acknowledge that, but then we also use some of these strategies and go, okay, no, I'm going to force myself to be happy.
Mm-hmm. Awesome question. So actually I won't pull up the graph. We all remember my scientific graph, right? So because I talked about it, it's impossible for us to be happy all of the time, right? But we can find more moments of happiness that we have now. When we look at, in terms of the sort of nuance to it, is that it requires a level of self-awareness to be able to determine that answer. And so some of them are obvious, right? Like if you're at a funeral, it doesn't make sense to be happy, right? Grief makes sense. But sometimes like day to day, we might just be having one of those like blah days. We all have them, right? And so this is where it's asking ourselves, not just looking at it in the moment, but is it a string of feeling bad, one good? Or is it like things are pretty good and then here and there we have like a moment or times that it's not? It's also, when we think about in terms of emotional expression, it's not really about how we should feel, it's about the match. So depending on the situation, what's going on. But at the same time, like, especially like in Toronto, it's been like super gray. Like I think you guys get more sun here, but you can tell the moods of people are different when we've had a lot of like gray days. And so that's a good example where it's like, do I just am like, oh, it's a gray day and I'm just going to like quit my day and watch Netflix? Or is it like, maybe I should go to the gym? And I think the answer isn't black or white, because some days the answer may be, and I've had days where I call my friend, I'm just like, I'm quitting my day. Like I'm just done with my day and I don't want to work because I'm not productive. But then when you give yourself that little break, the next day you often wake up feeling better. And that's a good indication that you made a good decision. Because if I would have forced myself to keep doing the day, I wouldn't have been productive. And then the next day when I woke up, I would have drained my energy. And so sometimes the answer may not be clear and the trial and error comes along, and that's where the self-awareness piece can come in to help us learn those things. But I think no matter what, the key piece, and there's so much research on like self-compassion and how when we have compassion for ourselves, that's the key thing. And so I think that when we can bring that in and then just check in and start to almost be a scientist of our own life and our own feelings, that's a good place to start. Awesome question. Thank you. And I love the color. That's another thing. In winter, if you're feeling gray and gloomy, putting on color can make you feel better. Yes.
Are there countries and regions that are happier than others?
Good question. So, are there countries that are happier than others? So, every year on March 20th, the International Day of Happiness, the United Nations, the World Health Organization releases a ranking system of all the countries in the world. And it's a little bit controversial how they do the algorithms and the math to do that, but if we just kind of set that aside for now, essentially, the top ones is all the Scandinavian countries that fight: Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. They all tend to take the top. Canada, we're usually like 8, 9, 10. Usually the States is slightly below us. And this is, in a way, it's a good evaluation because it's comprehensive. So it doesn't just assess like gross domestic product. It also looks at social supports, education system. They even ask questions like, if you lost your wallet, how confident are you that you get it back? So there is a wide variety of questions that are asked, so it's pretty good. The reason the Scandinavian countries get the top is because of their social support and their social connection. And even so Iceland in 2008, as a country, essentially went bankrupt. And so researchers were thinking, okay, we're going to see a huge dip in their happiness because they're bankrupt. And what they found was that, yes, there was a dip, but it wasn't nearly what they anticipated. And when they went in and unpacked why that is, what they found was that Iceland ranked #1 in the world on social support. And so, yes, there is sort of country rankings. It's not great, but generally the Scandinavian ones. But the other thing is sometimes people think, all the third world countries would be at the bottom and all the first world countries at the top, but we also don't see that clear pattern either. Even somewhere like Costa Rica, they're actually a lot higher than you would think oftentimes. And so, yes, there is, but it's not the be all end all. Great question. Provincial. So actually that did come out, and also city rankings, but all of those ones, the math is so questionable that and actually, so this Monday coming up, the 15th of January, is Blue Monday. Have any ever heard of this thing? It's but after the International Day of Happiness, it's my second busiest day of the year. And I spend the entire day on media saying, no, this is not the saddest day of the year. It is highly unlikely that this particular day, and it actually came from a travel company. They were trying to sell travel packages, so they made this algorithm where they included things like credit card bills coming in, darkness time, length of time till next holiday. They have this whole equation, and they come up with the third Monday in January to be the saddest day. And so, again, this is where those algorithm thing a little questionable, but yes, we tend to see moods dip in the winter, right? Seasonal affective disorder comes in, but it's not Monday. Don't worry. It's not the saddest day of the year. And actually, if you really like my dog Jocko, I'm going on breakfast television on Monday, and he's coming with me. So if you want to see Jocko on TV, tune into breakfast television on Monday. Because I told my producer, I was like, he'll bring extra happiness. And she was like, okay. So Jocko's going on TV. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciated the mention, especially of psychological safety. As you were talking, one of the things I was reflecting on is that writing on positive psychology generally refers to 3 dimensions, right? And certainly we've talked a lot about cultivating the positive, and about the dose response curve with happiness, microdosing and interventions. But the opposite is actually true, right? With chronic negative stressors, whether that's chronic racial stress, workplace violence, bullying, mistreatment in the workplace, all things that we deal with in the healthcare system, right? And so I just wondered which pieces of your research or what you might offer the leaders around the other 2 factors, like coping effectively with the negative and committing to personally meaningful goals and taking action.
Yeah, great question. So there's sort of 3 pieces, right? There's focusing on where we are and how do we be happy. And then also when we're feeling negative, how do we maybe buffer that? But there's also a third piece, which is sort of neutral, right? Where it's not positive or negative. And often what we see in research is that it's not about getting rid of the ends, the tails, the negative or the positive, but that area in between has an area of opportunity where we can take some of that neutral and bring it to positive. The thing is, with happiness, it's not like putting on rose-colored glasses and just pretending everything's okay, right? A lot of times the negative things are really difficult, and it's not about feeling them, right? Even in terms of healthy psychological functioning, when we have those situations, it's about acknowledging them for what they are. Sometimes when we're in them, we need to sort of go through them and then reflect back at what were the things that led up to this, or how long did it go on for? Even with sadness, like I was talking about, it's not that sadness is I used to think that sadness was the opposite of happiness. And it turns out, do you know what the opposite of happiness is? Apathy, exactly. Not caring at all. And so you can actually, if you think about happiness on a continuum, on one end you have really, really happy, and on one end not happy at all. And with sadness, you can have the same thing, and you can actually be happy and sad at the same time. That's called the bittersweet emotion. I think that one of the key things is being very realistic and honest. And this is where that psychological safety, that trust, that communication comes in. Because like I said, in my highly scientific graph, right, those red faces, they happen. And sometimes those red faces are from things that we had control over. And sometimes they're from things that we didn't have control over. And so when we can sort of take that step to acknowledge that and to create that environment where we can talk to people and find out what's going on is sort of the best. It's a very tricky thing. And so, yes, there's area of opportunity to focus on, good, getting better. But if you're in a bad mood, like I said, like that, it almost feels like toxic positivity, right? Where if we're just trying to force ourselves to be happy or something like that, which also is not a good plan. Yeah, thank you. Over here. Do we have a mic? Yeah. Hi.
Thank you very much. So my, excuse me, my question is, as leaders, we do a lot to help everybody be happy while we neglect ourselves. So I want you to advise on how to find the balance between satisfying everybody, getting work done, but also being on track on self.
Yeah, it's like one of the things, the hard truth is that we can't make someone else happy, right? It's like, if you know someone that's battling an addiction, right, we can't tell them to stop. Like there's a certain point where it's beyond what we can do, and we can wish it and we could hope it, but we can't push that on someone, because often when we try to push something on someone, what happens? They rebel, especially with if you ever interacted with children, right? When you tell them not to do something, what do? They just do it. And so part of it is understanding that we actually can't help someone be happy. And I get asked a lot a similar question from a parent, right, to a child. Like, how do I help my child be happy? And you ask every parent what they want for their kid, right? They say, I want my child to be happy. You can't make your child happy, right? They have to learn that for themselves. The best thing you can do is model that behavior for them. And I think especially as a leader, that's what it comes down to too, is we can create as much of an environment as possible to help them, right? To give them flexibility, to listen and try to focus on creating trust, building communication, creating psychological safety. But beyond creating that environment, at the end of the day, they may be a solar panel parking meter at the moment, right? Where it's something that, and we have to at some point understand that we can't just force that on someone. And so often, like I said, the best thing we can do is to model that behavior. It's kind of like, have you ever seen a friend that you haven't seen in a long time and they've been going to the gym and meditating and eating healthy? And when you see them, they just seem bright and vibrant. It's kind of like, oh, what are you doing? Right? And then they tell you, I'm on this gym plan or whatever it is they're doing. You're actually more motivated hearing that than having someone tell you the benefits of physical activity and why you go to the gym. And so, sometimes I think that although we really want that for people, we have to also give people the grace to go through their journey and support them and do the best that we can to model that behavior. Like the Buddha says, be the change you used to see in the world. I think that especially with happiness, that's one of the best things that we can do is really model that behavior. Great question. Thank you. Over here.
Where did you get your jacket? Asking for a friend.
Oh, where did I get this jacket? I got this jacket from the Home Shopping Channel. That's where I got it. The Home Shopping Channel. When I was in grad school, I used to I paid for all my grad school myself. So I was working a million jobs. And one of the things that I used to do was I used to fly to Florida and sell Reebok running shoes on the Home Shopping Channel. And also the Home Shopping Channel in Canada. And yeah. And so we were talking about this earlier, and I was saying, it's funny because it was just when you go on the Home Shopping Channel and you're the showstopper, the thing that goes, you do you basically are awake for 24 hours and you're constantly on. But when you're in grad school and you want to make a lot of money in a short amount of time, it's a good option. And so I would do it. But in hindsight now, it's one of the best things I did because one, you learn to think on your feet because on live TV, there's all these cameras, there's all this pressure and you have to just figure it out. And two, I realized that when you're selling a shoe, right, you're selling a shoe, but when I'm teaching in a university classroom, which is what I was doing at the time, I realized I'm still selling. I'm just selling an idea, right? The way that you communicate is so important. And so at HSN, they have what's called the employee warehouse. So all the stuff that goes on air, they can't sell it anymore, and they put it at 90% off. And I always bought luggage and all this stuff, but it's perfectly fine. And so I got this for 90% off at the Home Shopping Channel. Yeah, great question. Which, you know, it's funny. One of my best friends is an international fashion designer, and like 90% of the time I'm wearing her stuff. But a lot of it you have to iron, and this is really good for travel. So normally I'm wearing my friend's stuff, RV&G, but today, Shopping Channel's finest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an outstanding talk. I think one of the questions is really around how many hours per week of work is related to happiness. I mean, there's some literature coming that, you know,
4 hour, that sort of 4
exactly.
day work week.
Yeah, exactly. And many of us as administrators and leaders, it's like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, so how do you recommend that for leaders?
So I've seen a lot of inconsistent findings depending on who's doing it and how they're playing with the numbers and who's doing it. But what I will say is that productivity is not linear, right? If, you know, you're super productive and then you're going on 8 hours and you haven't eaten anything and you haven't done all those things, you slowly grind it away, but you're not doing nearly the capacity that you are. I think that part of the problem and part of the reason that we don't have a very clear answer is because different people work differently, right? And also some people like I'm a morning person. I'll get up in the morning and I'm great. But then like midday, I need to go to the gym because I'm just done. And then it kind of resets me. Some people like to nap. So I think more than that, it's again, that self-awareness piece of like what works best for me. Kind of hard when you're running a team though, and they all want to work for 4 days. But what you can do is, like I was saying, like have some awareness around it because there's no clear-cut answer. Like I'm actually on the advisory board for Staples. You know Staples? They have this remote work council, and so they basically put all of Staples senior leadership and like a prof from U of T that works on remote work and like an ergonomics person. I'm like the happiness person. Joe Mimoran, you know, the Dragon on Dragon's Den, he does a bunch of stuff. So we all sit quarterly in this room and brainstorm things with Staples. And we were actually having this conversation a couple weeks ago, actually just before Christmas. And so the thing is there is a huge push where people want to go to the 4 hour thing. And a lot of times it sounds bad, but it's not the hours that need to be measured, it's the output that needs to be focused on. And so if in 4 days, like if I could know that I get an extra day off, I may be more motivated to be, and like after I finished my undergrad, I worked in public health at the Middlesex London Health Unit for 1.5 years before I went back to do my master's. And I remember I'd never worked in public health before, and I came from like university, we were studying all the time. And like the amount of like parties and time that we spent chatting at the water cooler it just felt inefficient to me in a lot of ways. And so it's not necessarily the hours that I was in the health unit, but it's what did I do during that time? And so sometimes seeing that, and if you can actually give someone autonomy and they can feel empowered and motivated, you actually might get more productivity out of them in less time if they feel autonomous or flexible with the hours or things like that. But if there's no clear answer, because there's no clear answer to even what makes us happy. It's different for all of us, and it changes throughout our life. And so the same thing with this, it's like, it's hard to know, but that awareness piece is always a good first step. Yeah, thank you. In the back.
What's the role of spirituality in happiness?
Sorry, spiritual. Ooh, good question. Let's just raise our hands. Who thinks that people that are spiritual or religious are more happy? Who thinks no? Who doesn't know? Spirituality and happiness, what's the connection? So are people that are religious or spiritual happier, right? So what's interesting is, you know how I showed that graph and, you know, we started the burst in happiness was about mid-90s? We've learned a lot since then. And so if we were to look back like early 2000s, a lot of studies came out that actually went into religious organizations, and it was different ones. So Jewish ones, Muslim ones, Catholic ones. So it wasn't the religion itself, but anyone that had a religion, those people were happier than people that didn't. And so then the headline became, religion makes people happier. And then when they actually started to unpack it a little bit more, that's right, exactly right. It wasn't the actual religious piece that was the primary driver of happiness. It was the social connection. And so often in a religious or spiritual place, we have that connection. We have those people, right? Like my mom is very active in her church, and if someone has something or whatever, they all like bake casseroles and they drop them off, right? Like they have that support. And also you look at, then there's purpose, there's meaning, right? Like you have shared values, you have all those commonalities, you have that communication and connection. So it's not necessarily that it's spirituality in particular that makes people happier, but it's the connection that comes from that can. Great question. Any more? Hi, yes, I love your questions. Do you want to know where my shoes are from? Browns, Eaton Center.
I hope they come in size 14. What's your morning routine like?
Ooh, okay. So morning routines is like the super trendy thing these days, right? And as a person, I tend to extremes. Like I don't just become raw or vegan, I become like a raw vegan. I tried that for a bit, didn't work. And so when the morning routine thing started, I was like, oh, and it makes sense to me. So the idea is that when you're intentional about certain activities in your morning, then taking that time for yourself really sets your day up for success. And I think that makes sense, because if you ever like slept in and then you rush out the door and it feels like chaos the whole day. So I think that having something in the morning to kind of set your day up is great. Now, because I tend to extremes, that ended up, I'd hear, oh, well, it's good to meditate, okay? And then it's like, oh, it's good to journal. But then you also have to gratitude journal. And then you have to do stream of consciousness pages where you just write things down on a page with no thinking. And so my morning routine started to become like an hour process. And then it was like so much work. And I'm like, this doesn't work for me either. And so you kind of come back to the middle. What my morning routine looks like now is I do something in the morning, but it's not always the same. So I'm not I have such perfectionist tendencies that it was really hard for me to sort of surrender this idea that I can't do everything all the time. But the self-awareness piece, it just keeps coming up. And I think that some mornings, it's probably good for me to meditate. And some mornings, it might be good for me to get up and go for a walk. Or it might be good for me to get up and do nothing, just sit in silence for a little bit. The one thing that I do at some point in my morning is I have these like daily books. So there's a book called The Daily Stoic, and it has like one Stoic thought per day. One of my other favorite authors, Robert Greene, has one called The Daily Laws. So it's like one sort of thought. Grammar Girl has a daily book called Grammar Girl Daily, which I read. And so it takes like less than 5 minutes. And also, like, for example, I didn't bring the books with me to Winnipeg, but I'll do a couple when I get back, just because I just like to have like a little hit of information. And then some days I may go to the gym in the morning, but I do something intentional, but I've really let go of that. And I really just sort of, when I wake up, I ask myself, what do I need? But the one thing that I do consistently is I have quiet in the morning. Like I don't put on music. I don't put on like my phone. I know that everyone says that, but like if you actually try it, it's a game changer. And then I also went as far as, because then for a while I was like, I would go on my phone, but I need it for my alarm clock, right? So now I actually bought myself an alarm clock for like $12 on Amazon. And so that's a huge thing. Creating that space and that quiet and that pause in the morning for me is something that has been really important. Yeah, great question. Oh, we got one more. Thank you. More color, I love it.
Yeah, I decided to be colorful today. It kind of goes against their question, but like as a parent of young children, I wonder how can I bring that into my life when I have to make lunches in the morning while doing those, intentional thoughts of happiness and going to work. I just
and then
wonder if you have any
wakes up
tools for that. Yeah.
So all my degrees are in health science, but my specialization in my master's was child and youth health. And I finished my PhD in November of 2019, and then I moved to Toronto, and I started doing research at Sick Kids. And I was doing a lot of like knowledge translation, mental health stuff there. And a couple things that we would talk about is one, like, we have to give ourselves grace. Like as a parent, you're not going to be perfect. Sometimes when I do more parenting talk, I put up this tweet that a pediatrician put on Twitter, and she's like, I'm a best-selling author of 3 children's books and a pediatrician, and my children had strawberries dipped in ketchup for dinner. Because I think that sometimes we're always and then Instagram and social media make it worse, right? Because you see these like beautiful family photos of people and you're like, but it's their highlight reel. And so one, I think compassion and grace, that it's always going to be fluid and messy and whatever. Can you do certain things that maybe increase your likelihood of reducing your stress? Like, for example, maybe it's making the lunches the night before so that you're not scrambling. Like, if you look in the morning, where does my chaos happen? Is there anything I can do to mitigate any of that? And maybe you can't, right? Like, maybe it's just your kids wake up and they don't want to get out of bed, and that's the problem. And then hopefully it's a phase. But it's looking at where are the biggest areas of chaos and where can I delegate? The other thing, like a lot of times people ask me the question, like, can money buy happiness, right? And basically what the research says is that once your basic needs are met, then more money doesn't mean more happiness. If you're like concerned about paying the rent or putting food on your table, it absolutely does. But once you're past that, it doesn't. The one way that you can actually use money to increase your happiness is what's called time affluence. So buying back time. So the other thing that you can do is look at, is there anything in my life that I could outsource or do less frequently that may give me back time? Because when you get that time, then maybe you could use it for different things. Like, for example, like, do you need to go to the grocery store for like $5 now? You can have your groceries delivered, right? Or certain things like that where you can actually sort of spend a little bit of money, but the time that you get back is way more valuable than that. So sometimes there's area of opportunity, but I think the biggest thing is really that grace to just, if you're doing the best that you can, then that's the best you can ever expect, right? And sometimes the best that we can do is not a great day, right? And sometimes it is, because different days are different. So yeah, great question. Thank you. All right.
On that note, I think we're going to wrap up, Dr. Mandich. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on behalf of CHI, the University, Shared Health, and our other partners. I know it takes time, right, to come across the country and spend time here, but we've highly valued the conversation tonight and stimulating us to think deeper and broader in our lives as leaders and where we're going. And I hope tomorrow you have some surprises.
I know.
And enjoy the day.
Thank you. I actually, I went for dinner in my hotel last night, and I sat down, and I'm at the Fort Garry, and there's a restaurant in there, an Italian one, not the one straight back, but there's an Italian one. I sat down, and then the server came over with a French horn with it looked like a giant Cheerio on the top, and it was like from the chef as like an amuse-bouche, and they said, "Welcome, here we have lots of surprises. This is your first one of the night." And I said, "Oh my goodness, that makes me so happy." And then I was gonna get out my iPad and read. And then the next one that came out was like an hourglass with like a deep fried cheese ball on top. And he said, "We brought this to you to remind you that time is precious and that we need to be present." And I was like, okay, better put the iPad away. So I even had some lovely surprises here in Windsor. And tonight was such a wonderful surprise too. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. So on behalf of everyone, I just want to give you a round of applause. Thanks very much. And on that, we're dismissed, right? All right. Thank you.
All right. Drive safe, everybody. Thank you.